Today's lecture is on Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders. So the countries in Southeast Asia that we're talking about, you can see here on the slide, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar. The earliest human settlers arrived in Southeast Asia roughly about 50,000 years ago. And in that time, big time gap between 50,000 years and 4,000 years ago when they began to set up agriculture, modern agricultural practice. Prior to that, like many parts of the world that we've studied, the people there were hunter-gatherers and had to figure out how to find settlements that would support large amounts of life. So usually those are places where there's a water source, usually a river. There's abundant food sources to forage from until they can figure out the agriculture part. And so the soil was good, lots of good land to grow foods on. And at that time, about 4,000 years ago, the crops that grew really well were millet and rice, much like what we see in southern China. Those calories and the reliable food allowed a population boom to occur. So we ended up with lots of people in that area. And when you have lots of people, eventually you need civilizations set up. So some of the very earliest civilizations that existed in Southeast Asia were the Khmer, or Khmer, I've heard it both ways, which is in modern Cambodia, and the Mon civilization, which is in modern Myanmar. Because of where Southeast Asia is situated, eventually this civilization allowed the people to engage in trade with nearby nations. And so there was quite a lot of trade that was occurring with China, which was to the north, and India, which was to the west. And of course, wherever different civilizations and different peoples are coming together, there's an exchange of ideas. So things like religious ideas, governmental ideas, food ideas, and goods were traded. So there's, in terms of food, a lot of mixing of ideas and cooking techniques and different ingredients that might not necessarily have been native to Southeast Asia. By the time the Europeans showed up in the 16th century or the 1500s, they found a civilization, multiple civilizations that were actively engaged in trade. Of course, the Europeans wanted a piece of this action because they wanted to be in on the spice trade, which was really lucrative. And the Dutch East India Company was a venture by the Dutch, obviously. They had settlements in parts of Southeast Asia and India and South Africa to engage in the spice trade. And so what happened was 16th century, they came, they had outposts along the spice routes, and that eventually led to colonization. So you had Dutch and other Europeans from Spain, from Portugal, and eventually from France moving into the area. And what happened is not only was there a contribution of different cultures from China and India, but there was also quite a lot of European ideas and foods and cooking techniques and religious ideas that spread into this part of the world as well. The picture that you see there is Angkor Wat, which is as you see, 12th century. It started as a Hindu temple complex, and Hinduism, if you remember from the religion lecture, is native to India. And early on in Southeast Asia, Hinduism was very prominent in the area and was eventually taken over by Buddhist beliefs, and those were coming from China. So when this started out as a Hindu temple, it eventually became a Buddhist temple. This is located in Cambodia, and it eventually became a mausoleum for some leaders during that time. The first mass immigration of Southeast Asians to the United States began soon after the Vietnam War, and that's when North Vietnam essentially took over South Vietnam. North Vietnam was in favor of a communist regime, and South Vietnam was essentially the resistance that had been backed by the United States in that conflict. So when the South fell to the North, there were many Vietnamese that were in danger because they had not been on the favorable side of that conflict. So this happened in 1975, and because the U.S. had backed South Vietnam, they granted asylum to roughly about 60,000 Vietnamese, assisted them in immigration to the United States. And there were further waves of Vietnamese that were leaving. As in many cases, when there's political instability in an area, it's the people that have the most resources and have the most education that tend to get out first, and they're followed by people that are poorer and who don't have as much education. They just don't have the resources to leave a deteriorating situation. So what you see in the picture here is a very overcrowded boat, and in the mid-70s, mid to late 70s, it was not uncommon to hear about Southeast Asian boat people desperately trying to leave Southeast Asia to avoid political persecution. Unfortunately, many of those people died. Many more made it to the United States or to other places where they took refuge, but quite a few were lost in that process. Cambodia and Laos, those in this same period of the late 70s were the sites of refugee camps. And so there were a lot of efforts to get those people out of Southeast Asia as well, so and into the United States. And so there was a huge immigration push into the United States throughout the mid to late 70s and into the early 80s. So we're going to talk about each of the groups as individuals now. We'll start with the Vietnamese. The vast majority of Vietnamese who came to the United States, they were generally of the mind that education was really important and they wanted to assimilate very quickly. They were very grateful to the United States for taking them in such a difficult time. More than 700,000 Vietnamese have entered the United States since 1975, and of all of the Southeast Asian countries, more Vietnamese came over than from any of the other countries. In 2006, the U.S. Census estimated over 1.6 million Vietnamese in the United States, and roughly 50% of those are foreign born, which if you consider that the 70s are fairly recent history in terms of who immigrated, it's not surprising that roughly 50% of them were born overseas. Many of them settled in the Gulf Coast region, so in and around New Orleans and Louisiana, and that is not surprising because many Vietnamese in this area who ended up leaving, they were fishermen or they were farmers. Southeast Asia, of course, is surrounded by water, and seafood is really important to the diet. So many made their living by fishing or crabbing or otherwise gathering seafood. And so the um, the Gulf Coast region was very similar to what they had come from. Many more settled in the California Central Valley, and so we saw a huge settlement in Stockton and Point South and here in Sacramento. And that was in large part because of the agricultural region. Of course, California, the Central Valley, is a very rich agricultural region. So it was another place where many of these Vietnamese who had been farmers in their home country could come and earn a living doing something that they knew how to do. Where Vietnamese settled into urban areas, as with so many other groups that come from other countries who are immigrating to the United States, they tend to sort of bond together and make their own insular neighborhoods. And so the Vietnamese, as with so many others, did that. And so many times those neighborhoods have been known as Little Saigon. And in Sacramento, we do have one. If you're driving north on Highway 99 and you're going through South Sacramento, there'll be a sign that says Little Saigon. And so here in Sacramento, it's on Stockton Boulevard, located between Fruit Ridge and Florin Roads. And if you go in there, you're going to see a lot of Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian, although primarily Vietnamese run businesses. So restaurants and laundries and other businesses that are catering to Vietnamese immigrants and their families. Generally, Vietnamese immigrants do pretty well, as I mentioned, because they are of the opinion that education is really important, and so many came here and were educated and do actually quite well uh, in a socioeconomic status. Cambodians, Laotians, and Thais, there are fewer of these people from these countries that have immigrated to the United States, but definitely still worth mentioning. Cambodians, in the 2000 U.S. Census, identified about 178,000 Cambodian Americans. As with the Vietnamese, about 50% are foreign born. Very large populations are in California, as with all of our Southeast Asian groups. Big populations in Stockton, and Long Beach has a pretty significant population as well. Generally, Cambodians and Laotians in particular are not as economically successful. That's simply because the immigrants that came from these areas were of lower educational status and didn't have the same push for higher education as Vietnamese did. And so generally coming here, they many of them were in agriculture, and that's just where they stayed because that's where they were happy. Laotians, there are very large populations, again in Stockton. Here in Sacramento, we have quite a few, and then further south into the Central Valley, Fresno, we see quite a few as well. Again, without the push for education, we generally see people don't do quite as well socioeconomically. And in terms of poverty rates, you can see that Laotian poverty rates are estimated to be at about 33%. So 1 in 3 Laotian immigrants struggle with poverty. People from Thailand, over 100,000 have immigrated to the United States since the 1970s. Most have settled in Los Angeles, New York, and Texas. They do a little bit better socioeconomically than Cambodians or Laotians generally, but not quite as well as Vietnamese. They do tend to acculturate very rapidly upon moving here. One of the things that we mentioned early on is when you have a foreign-born adults that are moving here, they're the first generation immigrants.
Um, what happens is when they have children who are American born, um, the rate of acculturation is very rapid, and so within a generation or two, you have very Americanized Southeast Asian children, and that can sometimes lead to a little bit of conflict, and we'll talk about that. So we're going to talk about worldview a bit, and we'll talk about family and religion. And we talked about the once as civilization was building, we have the onset of organized religions, and as I had mentioned, Hinduism was very important in the area early on, and then eventually it switched over to Buddhism. And in the case of all of these countries and all of these peoples from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and the other countries in Southeast Asia, Buddhism is the most prominent religion now. But before organized religion, as with so many of our other cultures that we've discussed, there were religions that were rooted in myth and superstition and just very primitive early religions. And many times bits and pieces of that stick around. And that's certainly the case here in Southeast Asia. One of the things that we see a lot of in this part of the world is ancestor worship. And that is just the belief that when your ancestors die, one of your duties is to try to appease your ancestors by your thoughts and by your actions. And if you don't do this, then there are repercussions for that. So, and I'll just read what I have here. Ancestor worship, spirit, and ghost beliefs are common and have often been incorporated into Eastern and Western religious practices or survive as superstitions. So there's a little bit of a syncretic belief here. So if you are, say, Christian or Buddhist, and that is your primary religion, you may still, may still be some older behaviors that just exist as a superstition that if you behave in such a way um, that displeases your ancestors, you may become ill or you may have some serious misfortune. And in the picture that you see here, they are these three little structures here. These are spirit houses, and these are located in Thailand. Many houses have these little structures just outside, and what they're designed for is if the spirits of your dead ancestors are coming to visit you, it's better that you have a place for them to go into when they visit rather than come into your home. Because if they come into your home, they may disrupt your home. And families want to keep that from happening. And so the spirit house is simply um, to give the spirit some place to dwell so they don't cause any problems. So let's talk about family. As in many Asian cultures, family is seen as an interdependent unit. So again, this is another structure, as we see in many parts of the world that we've talked about lately, where the individual is not nearly as important as the group. And so good behavior and manners and everything that you do is related to how it's going to affect the group. So if you act poorly, if you bring shame upon your family by doing something, you're not just injuring yourself, you're injuring the whole family, the whole group dynamic, the whole group unit. And that's something that you don't want to do. Many Asian um, cultures, elders are accorded much respect. And if you think about American culture, we really don't do that here. It's really sort of the opposite. In Asia, when you look at Asian cultures, when you look at an older person, it is with the utmost respect for their wisdom. And here in the West, we tend to value youth more, youth and attractiveness and how really how people look rather than what they know or who they are. And so there's a little bit of a clash of cultures. And so when Asians, particularly older Asians, when they come here, they may be used to that sort of respect. And in American culture, since that's not as valued, that can become a problem with succeeding generations of younger Asians that are American born, and they're becoming more accultured in the American way of life, that elders may not get as much respect as they feel that they're accorded. And so sometimes that can cause some internal family problems because the youth are seen as more individual, and they see themselves as more individual and not really paying heed to the importance of that group dynamic. So it's not unusual to see intergenerational conflict. Some parts of Southeast Asia, particularly in Cambodia and Laos, women had equal standing with men. And so it was not as much of a women are subservient to their husbands as we see in many other parts of the world. You don't really see that in some parts of Southeast Asia until the Europeans showed up. So when the Europeans showed up in the 16th century, some of their ideas and, of course, other things were adopted. And so that idea of women being subservient to their husbands was actually brought about by the Europeans in those parts of the world. We'll shift our attention to health beliefs and practices. As you see there, much of Southeast Asia developed under the influence of the Chinese, particularly Vietnam. Vietnam is just south of China. And so there is a free flow of ideas. And of course, along with everything else, health beliefs and practices are ideas that are transmitted. We talked last week about Chinese traditional medicine and how old it is. Very, very old practice. And there are some thoughts that in Southeast Asia, a version of traditional medicine was also being developed that was influenced by the Chinese system as far as the beliefs of balance, the whole yin-yang system goes, but that Southeast Asian medicine and Chinese medicine really sort of developed independently of each other. But during the period of time where there was a lot of trade going on, ultimately both Vietnamese and Chinese shared ideas with one another. And so there was a trading of not only ideas, but of herbs and different remedies that crisscrossed with each other. So they appear to have developed simultaneously, but they eventually ended up mutually influencing one another. So we just were talking about indigenous beliefs about illness center on the supernatural world, particularly as related to malevolent spirits or angry ancestors. And as far as much of Southeast Asia is concerned, keeping healthy requires personal harmony with, as you see there, the supernatural world, nature, society, and correctly fulfilling your obligations to the family unit, so that group dynamic. Balance is the key here. So balance with everything keeps you in good health. In terms of society, you need to act in such a way that you are keeping your relations, you're treating them well, you're not doing anything that's going to bring shame upon your family, or cause you to personally get sick because you've treated somebody badly. So it's actually a belief that really sort of keeps everybody kind of behaving well, because the repercussions can be pretty severe. Generally, illness is defined by its cause rather than its symptoms. So if you are ill for some reason, what is going to be done to remedy that is to figure out what it was that that caused the illness. So we're not going to focus so much on the symptoms that you're suffering. We're going to devote our time to figuring out where you got out of balance, whether it was because of an angry ancestor, or because you treated somebody badly, or you just did something that threw everything out of whack. So in this same vein, Vietnamese tend to believe health is related to personal destiny. So how one has behaved in past lives and the number of good deeds performed by one's ancestors determine one's experiences in life. And this goes hand in hand with the Buddhist belief that you continue to be reincarnated and come back until you get everything right, and are able to enter into that higher spiritual consciousness. So again, behaving oneself and doing what's expected of you is seen as very important. Um, Vietnamese traditionally also believe that the body is sustained by different souls. And so keeping all of what the different souls need in balance is seen as really important too, to enter into that divine consciousness that we talked about in the religion lecture. Like we saw in Mexico and South America, strong emotions can cause some really dangerous side effects. One of the things that if somebody's experiencing very, very strong emotions is thought to happen is the soul can actually leave the body. And if a body loses its soul, it's considered very serious and detrimental to the person's health. So what we could talk about here is again what we talked about in many parts of Latin America, that somebody having very strong emotion is probably having some sort of a mental issue, and so mental health, protection of mental health, and seeking out treatment is really important to keep someone from being sick. And so that, can differ a lot from Western biomedicine, where we tend to throw pills at problems rather than maybe looking at other causes, whether it's prayer or talk therapy or whatever the case may be. Cambodians, Laotian, and Hmong. We didn't talk too much about Hmong. Hmong are ethnically Chinese people that live in Southeast Asia in the mountains, and many of them have also immigrated to the United States, specifically to the Sacramento area and Stockton. These groups also very much believe in spiritual intervention and health, very concerned with ancestor worship and pleasing their ancestors and acting in accord with what they feel their ancestors want. Laotians believe there are spirits that oversee the health of each organ of the body, so they'll want to pay homage to those spirits. As with many other groups that we've seen, traditional healing generally starts with the women of the family, maybe an elder woman, a grandmother or a great-grandmother, or mother is generally the first one that takes a look at the uh, the person who is ill and then determines what the next steps would be, whether it can be handled at home or whether an herbalist is needed or if some other intervention is needed. Let's turn our attention to food, and we're going to talk about traditional food habits in Southeast Asia. When you look at the ingredients that are available in this part of the world, among the different countries, they're really not that different. You're going to see the same themes over and over again between Thailand and Vietnam, Cambodia, and the rest of them. But the thing that's different is the colonial influence they had. We talked about European colonization of many of these countries, and so many of them still have significant food practice and culinary uh, marks on them that still show up today. And in the picture, you see a banh mi sandwich. It's a Vietnamese sandwich, but it's got a very French flair to it. If you remember, in the 19th century, the French colonized Vietnam and left a very strong mark there. So this is a sandwich that has some very Asian flavors on it. It's got cilantro and it's got chilies and it's got cucumbers and some meat and it's served on a French baguette roll. And so that's an example of one of those marks. Um, all throughout Southeast Asia, as you saw on the map, there's a lot of coastline, a lot of long coastlines, a lot of islands. And so, as you can imagine, when that's the case, when we see a country that has that much coastline or countries that have that much coastline, seafood and fish are really common in the diet, and that is certainly the case in Southeast Asian countries. Um, because they're in a tropical environment, we see lots of tropical fruits and vegetables. Um, they use a lot more fruit in Southeast Asia than you see up north in China. China, they're very heavy on the vegetables, but very light on the fruit. Southeast Asia, again, just because of the availability and what grows there, you see a lot more fruit in the diet. Of course, rice is very commonly used, and unlike some parts of Asia where there's a preference for long grain or short grain rice, Southeast Asians will eat either long grain, short grain. They have different ways to prepare each one, and they'll use them both evenly. The Chinese, of course, longtime trading partners with Southeast Asia, and of course there was some colonization of the Chinese into Vietnam. They introduced long grain rice, which is their preference. They tend to eat long grain rice in China, and then short grain rice in Japan is what you see favored there. So they introduced long grain rice, they introduced soy products, and they introduced stir frying to Southeast Asia. The French we just talked about, they were in Vietnam, introduced French bread, asparagus, potatoes, and coffee. Um, Here in the United States, actually here in Sacramento, we have the restaurant chain called La Bou, which is short for La Boulangerie, which is French for bakery. The family that owns La Bou is Vietnamese, and so they learned how to make French croissants and French breads and those sorts of things. And so that chain has been around for quite some time. There was also a lot of influence, as I mentioned earlier, from India. And so people from India or Asian Indians, and then people further south from Malaysia and Indonesia introduced curry and coconut in the cooking. And so we see a lot of that as well in Southeast Asia. So core foods for this part of the world, as I just was saying, rice. It's universal. as a carbohydrate source. There is some wheat, some bread, again, because of outside influence. Secondary foods, fish and seafood, very prominent in Southeast Asian cuisine, but you also see soy products, soy proteins such as tofu, and poultry, pork, goat, and beef. Complementary foods, this is where Southeast Asia really defines itself in terms of different ingredients that when you taste them, you know unmistakably it's not Japanese, it's not Chinese, it is uniquely Southeast Asian. So those are things like lemongrass in particular. Fish sauce is something that's used very frequently here. Chilies, of course, chilies were not introduced to the area until the Europeans brought them in the 16th century, but now chilies figure very prominently in Southeast Asian cuisine. Ginger, garlic, curries, herbs like cilantro, and we just talked about lemongrass, mint, coconut and coconut milk, soy sauce. Fish sauce, if you've never had it, is really sort of it's an interesting ingredient, and it's used very liberally throughout Southeast Asia. It's made a little differently today than it was traditionally. Fish sauce, what they do is they take fish, and many times it's an anchovy or an anchovy type fish, and they get a bunch of them and they salt them in a container, salt them down, and then seal them off and just leave them to rot and to ferment. And fermentation adds its own flavors to the fish. And what happens eventually is the salt dries out the fish flesh, draws out all of the liquid, and the liquid runs out of the container that contains the fermented fish. And so this liquid is what becomes fish sauce. So it's very fishy, it's very funky, it's very salty, and it has its really unique flavor that is used in many parts of Asia, but very heavily in Southeast Asia. We're going to switch our focus to the Pacific Islanders here. And as you can see on the map, there are three broad areas of Pacific Islands. The first is Polynesia, which you can see in the north stretches from Hawaii all the way down south to New Zealand. It encompasses French Polynesia, which is where Tahiti is. Samoa is in there. Micronesia is, you can see there, it contains Guam, which is a U.S. territory, and the Marshall Islands. And then farther south we have Melanesia, which contains New Guinea and Fiji, if you've heard of those. And also we're going to talk about the Philippines. We're not going to talk quite as much about New Zealand and Australia just because those are very heavily European settled, and so we're going to focus more on sort of a native Pacific Island diet. So one of the interesting things about Polynesia is you look at the square miles that Polynesia encompasses, and it is tremendous. It is amazing that by the 13th century, Polynesian explorers had figured out how to get to most of these islands and populate them. Essentially, they would leave the mainland in outrigger canoes, and they would use the tide and the sun and the moon and the currents to figure out where the land was. And so it's really pretty brilliant. As I mentioned, this group of islands contains Samoa, Tahiti, and the Easter Islands. The Spanish came along. As we know, the Spanish were doing a lot of exploring during the 16th century, and discovered these islands and engaged in colonization of some of them as well. So there was a lot of food introductions to people on these islands by the Spanish in terms of different ingredients such as pork and some other foodstuffs that eventually became very important. Micronesia, as I said, includes Guam and the Marshall Islands. Melanesia is interesting in that the people that settled into the Melanesian group of islands appear to have originally come from Africa. Now, Polynesia and Micronesia, those peoples that migrated there appear to be from a land mass that was before uh, everything split off. They were from both Asia and Australia. And so a very different group. So the word Melanesia, you see at the front of it is melon, same as in melanin. So what this indicates is that people that are on these islands have considerably darker skin, which is one of the reasons that they're believed to have migrated from Africa. So this includes Fiji and New Guinea. So the people on those islands tend to be darker skinned. We have here in Sacramento, we have quite a few people who have immigrated from Samoa and Fiji. We see a lot of that in Sacramento, so a lot of those Polynesian islanders right here. Traditional foods in the Pacific Islands are not all that different. And the food is not all that varied because, as you can imagine, on all of these small islands, there's not a lot of land, and much of the diet is based on things that grew wild on the land. And so traditional foods include things like coconuts, so coconut palms, very common in the area. Taro root, and you see a picture of that there. Taro root is sort of like it's an underground starchy tuber, so it's like cassava. We've talked about cassava in class. Potatoes, same thing. It's this starchy underground growing tuber. And anytime you grow a civilization and you grow populations, you need to have some sort of a reliable source of calories. And so carbohydrates, like these starches, are really important to help do that. So taro roots, like cassava and potatoes, can be boiled and mashed and made into all sorts of different preparations, but they contribute calories, which is really important. Cassava you see listed on there, and then sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes were another introduction by the Spanish because, as we know, potatoes came from South America. So they happened to grow very well on the islands, and so that became a traditional food as well. No surprise that you see a lot of fish and shellfish in there. Of course, we're dealing with islands, lots of coast for fishing, so that figures very prominently. Rice, introduced by the Spanish, so that's another crop that contributed to population growth in the islands as well. So the Philippines is an island, series of islands actually. It's a nation that has several different islands situated in the western Pacific Ocean. Philippine Islands, like uh, the islands in the South Pacific, began being habitated thousands of years ago. First inhabitants in the Philippine Islands are thought to have arrived about 67,000 years ago by boat from somewhere else. And so most of the folks that initially went to the Philippines are thought to have come from the same part of the world as the people that ended up in the Pacific Islands. That is, those from Asia and Australia, native Australians, coming and populating those islands. Since the Philippines is made up of several different islands, it's thought that the inhabitants on the different islands developed their own cultures in isolation from each other. And eventually, when they reached out and found that there were others, there was a mixing of culture that happened during that time. But the other thing that happened was
There were others from other parts of the world that discovered the Philippines, including the Chinese, um, Indonesia, Malaysia, and people from the Middle East, Arabic peoples coming to the Philippines. And one of the things that happened in the 16th century, of course, the Spanish showed up, as they showed up everywhere in the 16th century. The Philippines became a hub, a trade hub between the China and the Far East and the Middle East and the New World, America, and then eventually onto Europe. So the Philippines was sort of in the center of all of this. And so whenever you have an area where a lot of goods are going back and forth and being traded with other countries, you tend to see a lot of people from all over the world in that area. So what happened with the Philippines is that because they were in the middle of all this, they had this huge amount of goods and ideas and exchange happening, and it really profoundly affected what the Philippines became in terms of food and in terms of religious history and so forth. In the 16th century, as I said, the Spanish showed up. Ferdinand Magellan is the explorer that didn't discover the Philippines, it was already there. He just discovered it for the Spanish. As the Spanish did everywhere, they introduced Christianity. And the thing about the Philippines is that Christianity really took off there. And to this day, about 75% of the people in the Philippines are Roman Catholic, so it really held. And you can see in the picture there, the San Agustin Church is one of the oldest Roman Catholic churches in the Philippines, and it dates from that time. They also introduced higher education and universities in the area as well. The Philippines didn't become an independent nation until the 20th century. For a long time, they were considered to be affiliated with the United States. And the United States left a mark on the Philippines as well in terms of culture and food and so forth. So when the Philippines became a U.S. territory in 1898, a lot of Filipinos began to migrate to the United States. As you can see here, 113,000 young male Filipinos traveled to Hawaii in the early 20th century to work in the sugarcane fields, and many of them subsequently moved to the United States mainland. And that was, of course, to find opportunity, to find work, to find education. But as we talked about, when we talked about East Asia, there were in the, starting in the late 19th and on into the early 20th century, there were a series of Asian exclusion laws that were meant to keep people from migrating to the United States from Asia because of the thought that Asians were taking jobs away from Americans and so forth. So in 1924, those Asian exclusion laws that had been applied to Chinese and Japanese and Koreans were also extended to include Filipinos. And so that's when immigration stopped. And they stopped until about 1965 when those laws were changed. And as you see, by 1980, more than 350,000 Filipinos had come to the United States. Many settled into urban areas, generally very well educated. And those areas were referred to as Little Manilas. So I thought this was rather interesting. From the 1920s until the 1960s, the largest population of Filipinos outside the Philippines was really nearby here in Stockton, California. And you can see this picture here, storefront in Little Manila was a tailoring and dry cleaning shop. If we look at current demographics, the Filipino American population has more than doubled since 1980. About 3 million Filipinos live in the United States, and over half of them reside in California. You can take a look at this map right here, and you can see the darker pink shaded regions are very high population percentage of Filipinos, and you'll see a real heavy concentration in Hawaii and in California, and actually quite a bit in Alaska as well. As I mentioned, educational attainment is really high. This is seen as very important generally among Filipino families. And because, again, because of that education, many of them are economically very successful as well. So, so that's a trend that we see among Filipino Americans and their families. Family, extended family is important, as is extended kinship. A lot of this has to do with the Roman Catholic beliefs that people outside the family that are not blood related um, are help support the family and help make decisions and things like that. So godparents, people in the church, and those sorts of things can have some influence in the family as well. Children are taught to be obedient and respectful, and misbehavior may reflect poorly on the family as a whole. So again, there's that idea of the group being more important than the individual. As I mentioned, the majority of Filipinos are Roman Catholic. Small percentage are Muslim. So that's particularly Filipinos that come from the southern part of the Philippines. The farther south you go, the more Muslim it becomes. And that area is closer to Indonesia, and that's a very heavily Muslim area as well. As far as health beliefs go, that is also really influenced by religion and the thought that health is really more in the hands of God than anything that you can personally do to protect your health. It's the idea that if God means for me to be sick, or if I die, or a family member dies, it's because it was the will of God and not really anything else. The Spanish did push some of their ideas of health onto the Philippines, particularly that wind. The idea of wind is detrimental to a person, so protecting them from wind is important in health. There's also some hot-cold balance beliefs as well. The idea of the humoral medicines. If you remember, the humors, the different fluids that are in the body, if those are balanced with hot and cold, that can determine whether you're sick or whether you're well. So turning to traditional food habits, because as I mentioned, the Philippines is such a mixed bag of cultures and groups that have either traded with the Philippines or colonized the Philippines. Um, the, uh, the Filipino food has much more ingredients and techniques than you see in other parts of this world. It's this huge mix of Malaysian, Indonesian, Polynesian, Spanish, Chinese, and American influences. So the food is different, and it definitely has its own personality. Core foods include things like rice and noodles, very popular. Secondary foods, pork, chicken, fish. Of course, they have quite a lot of coastline, so again, you see the fish showing up there. Complementary foods can include anything from fish paste to ketchup. It just kind of depends on what sort of dish you're making. But fish paste is really common: chili peppers, garlic, lemongrass, soy sauce, vinegar, coconut. Dairy products also make an appearance here, and dairy products are not something that we generally see in Asia. Um, but we do see them to some degree in the Philippines, and that is in large part because of the American influence. And so, particularly a lot of desserts in the Philippines use condensed milk products, and so that is strictly American. And on the plate, you see a dish of lumpia, which are essentially egg rolls, Filipino style, and pancit, which is a dish of noodles, and it's very tasty. I like pancit quite a lot. So finally, we're going to wrap up with this slide and looking at the different regions in the Philippines. Regional cooking styles. The islands to the very north, Luzon is where the capital Manila is located on the southern end of that island. There's a very Chinese European influence in this. You see Chinese and Spanish kind of mixing in the foods that are offered there. Lots of fish and seafood, and stir frying is really common up there. The farther south you travel, you tend to see an influence more of the southern, the nations on the southern end. So in particular, Malaysia and Indonesia, you see much more island influence there. So as we move south into Bicol, that's the spicy hot foods, lots of peppers, lots of Malaysian Polynesian influence with coconut and things like that. The Visayas, which are eastern and western, as we continue south, we see a lot of sugarcane products there because that's what's grown there in great part. So there are a lot of desserts, lots of seafood in this area. Again, chilies and coconuts and those things like that. And Mindanao is the southern part, and very heavy Indonesian, Malaysian influence, and also much more Muslim on this end. So you're not going to see pork products used because of that Islamic environment. But you also see a lot more chilies and curries in this area, again because of the southern orientation of those islands. They're closer to Malaysia, and you get that curry influence there as well. So this concludes our lecture on Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands.